Great was the excitement that now prevailed, and the question of an attempt to capture the sea monster became the ruling theme of conversation. Mrs. Weldon expressed considerable doubt as to the prudence of venturing upon so great a risk with such a limited number of hands, but when Captain Hull assured her that he had more than once successfully attacked a whale with a single boat, and that for his part he had no fear of failure, she made no further remonstrance, and appeared quite satisfied. Having formed his resolve, the captain lost no time in setting about his preliminary arrangements. He could not really conceal from his own mind that the pursuit of a finback was always a matter of some peril, and he was anxious, accordingly, to make every possible provision which forethought could devise against all emergencies. Besides her longboat, which was kept between the two masts, the Pilgrim had 3 whaleboats, 2 of them slung to the starboard and larboard davits, and the third at the stern, outside the taffrail. During the fishing season, when the crew was reinforced by a hired complement of New Zealand whalemen, all 3 of these boats would be brought at once into requisition. But at present the whole crew of the Pilgrim was barely sufficient to man one of the 3 boats. Tom and his friends were ready to volunteer their assistance, but any offers of service from them were necessarily declined. The manipulation of a whaleboat can only be entrusted to those who are experienced in the work, as a false turn of the tiller or a premature stroke of the oar may in a moment compromise the safety of the whole party. Thus compelled to take all his trained sailors with him on his venturous expedition, the captain had no alternative than to leave his apprentice in charge of the schooner during his absence. Dick's choice would have been very much in favor of taking a share in the whale hunt, but he had the good sense to know that the developed strength of a man would be of far greater service in the boat, and accordingly, without a murmur, he resigned himself to remain behind. Of the 5 sailors who were to man the boat, there were 4 to take the oars, whilst Howick the boatswain was to manage the oar at the stern, which on these occasions generally replaces an ordinary rudder as being quicker in action in the event of any of the side oars being disabled. The post of harpooner was of course assigned to Captain Hull, to whose lot it would consequently fall first to hurl his weapon at the whale, then to manage the unwinding of the line to which the harpoon was attached, and finally to kill the creature by lance wounds when it should emerge again from below the sea. A method sometimes employed for commencing an attack is to place a sort of small cannon on the bows or deck of the boat, and to discharge from it either a harpoon or some explosive bullets, which make frightful lacerations on the body of the victim. But the Pilgrim was not provided with apparatus of this description. Not only are all the contrivances of this kind very costly and difficult to manage, but the fishermen generally are averse to innovations, and prefer the old-fashioned harpoons. It was with these alone that Captain Hull was now about to encounter the finback that was lying some 4 miles distant from his ship. The weather promised as favorably as could be for the enterprise. The sea was calm, and the wind moreover was still moderating, so that there was no likelihood of the schooner drifting away during the captain's absence. When the starboard whaleboat had been lowered, and the 4 sailors had entered it, Howick passed a couple of harpoons down to them, and some lances which had been carefully sharpened. To these were added 5 coils of stout and supple rope, each 600 feet long, for a whale when struck often dives so deeply that even these lengths of line knotted together are found to be insufficient. After these implements of attack had been properly stowed in the bows, the crew had only to await the pleasure of their captain. The Pilgrim, before the sailors left her, had been made to heave to, and the yards were braced so as to secure her remaining as stationary as possible. As the time drew near for the captain to quit her, he gave a searching look all round to satisfy himself that everything was in order. He saw that the halyards were properly tightened, and the sails trimmed as they should be, and then calling the young apprentice to his side, he said, "Now, Dick, I am going to leave you for a few hours. While I am away, I hope that it will not be necessary for you to make any movement whatever. However, you must be on the watch. It is not very likely, but it is possible that this finback may carry us out to some distance. If so, you will have to follow, and in that case, I am sure you may rely upon Tom and his friends for assistance." One and all, the Negroes assured the captain of their willingness to obey Dick's instructions, the sturdy Hercules rolling up his capacious shirt sleeves, as if to show that he was ready for immediate action. The captain went on, "The weather is beautifully fine, Dick, and I see no prospect of the wind freshening, but come what may, I have one direction to give you which I strictly enforce. You must not leave the ship. If I want you to follow us, I will hoist a flag on the boat hook." "You may trust me, sir," answered Dick, "and I will keep a good lookout." "All right, my lad, keep a cool head and a good heart. You are second captain now, you know. I never heard of anyone of your age being placed in such a post. Be a credit to your position." Dick blushed, and the bright flush that rose to his cheeks spoke more than words. "The lad may be trusted," murmured the captain to himself. "He is as modest as he is courageous. Yes, he may be trusted." It cannot be denied that the captain was not wholly without compunction at the step he was taking. He was aware of the danger to which he was exposing himself, but he beguiled himself with the persuasion that it was only for a few hours, and his fisherman's instinct was very keen. It was not only for himself. The desire upon the part of the crew was almost irresistibly strong that every opportunity ought to be employed for making the cargo of the schooner equal to her owner's expectations. And so he finally prepared to start. "I wish you all success," said Mrs. Weldon. "Many thanks," he replied. Little Jack put in his word. "And you will try and catch the whale without hurting him much." "All right, young gentleman," answered the captain. "He shall hardly feel the tip of our fingers." "Sometimes," said Cousin Benedict, as if he had been pondering the expedition in relation to his pet science, "sometimes there are strange insects clinging to the backs of these great mammifers. Do you think you are likely to procure me any specimens?" "You shall soon have the opportunity of investigating for yourself," was the captain's reply. "And you, Tom, we shall be looking to you for help in cutting up our prize when we get it alongside," continued he. "We shall be quite ready, sir," said the negro. "One thing more, Dick," added the captain. "You may as well be getting up the empty barrels out of the hold. They will be all ready." "It shall be done, sir," answered Dick promptly. If everything went well, it was the intention that the whale after it had been killed should be towed to the side of the schooner, where it would be firmly lashed. Then the sailors with their feet in spiked shoes would get upon its back and proceed to cut the blubber, from head to tail, in long strips, which would first be divided into lumps about 1.5 feet square, the lumps being subsequently chopped into smaller portions capable of being stored away in casks. The ordinary rule would be for a ship, as soon as the flaying was complete, to make its way to land where the blubber could be at once boiled down, an operation by which it is reduced by about 1/3 of its weight, and by which it yields all its oil, the only portion of it which is of any value. Under present circumstances, however, Captain Hull would not think of melting down the blubber until his arrival at Valparaiso, and as he was sanguine that the wind would soon set in a favorable direction, he calculated that he should reach that port in less than 3 weeks, a period during which his cargo would not be deteriorated. The latest movement with regard to the Pilgrim had been to bring her somewhat nearer the spot where the spouts of vapor indicated the presence of the coveted prize. The creature continued to swim about in the reddened waters, opening and shutting its huge jaws like an automaton, and absorbing at every mouthful whole myriads of animalcula. No one entertained a fear that it would try to make an escape. It was the unanimous verdict that it was a fighting whale, and one that would resist all attacks to the very end. As Captain Hull descended the rope ladder and took his place in the front of the boat, Mrs. Weldon and all on board renewed their good wishes. Dingo stood with his forepaws upon the taffrail, and appeared as much as any to be bidding the adventurous party farewell. When the boat pushed off, those who were left on board the Pilgrim made their way slowly to the bows, from which the most extensive view was to be gained. The captain's voice came from the retreating boat. "A sharp lookout, Dick, a sharp lookout, one eye on us, one on the ship." Illustration: the captain's voice came from the retreating boat. Page 72. Illustration: I must get you to keep your eye upon that man. Page 73. "Aye, aye, sir," replied the apprentice. By his gestures, the captain showed that he was under some emotion. He called out again, but the boat had made such headway that it was too far off for any words to be heard. Dingo broke out into a piteous howl. The dog was still standing erect, his eye upon the boat in the distance. To the sailors, ever superstitious, the howling was not reassuring. Even Mrs. Weldon was startled. "Why, Dingo, Dingo," she exclaimed, "this isn't the way to encourage your friends. Come here, sir, you must behave better than that." Sinking down on all fours, the animal walked slowly up to Mrs. Weldon and began to lick her hand. "Ah," muttered old Tom, shaking his head solemnly, "he doesn't wag his tail at all. A bad omen." All at once the dog gave a savage growl. As she turned her head, Mrs. Weldon caught sight of Negoro making his way to the forecastle, probably actuated by the general spirit of curiosity to follow the maneuvers of the whaleboat. He stopped and seized a handspike as soon as he saw the ferocious attitude of the dog. The lady was quite unable to pacify the animal, which seemed about to fly upon the throat of the cook, but Dick Sands called out loudly, "Down, Dingo, down!" The dog obeyed, but it seemed to be with extreme reluctance that he returned to Dick's side. He continued to growl, as if still remembering his rage. Negoro had turned very pale, and having put down the handspike, made his way cautiously back to his own quarters. "Hercules," said Dick, "I must get you to keep your eye upon that man." "Yes, I will," he answered, significantly clenching his fists. Dick took his station at the helm, whence he kept an earnest watch upon the whaleboat, which under the vigorous plying of the seaman's oars had become little more than a speck upon the water. Chapter 8. A Catastrophe. Experienced whaleman as he was, Captain Hull knew the difficulty of the task he had undertaken. He was alive to the importance of making his approach to the whale from the leeward, so that there should be no sound to apprise the creature of the proximity of the boat. He had perfect confidence in his boatswain, and felt sure that he would take the proper course to ensure a favorable result to the enterprise. "We mustn't show ourselves too soon, Howick," he said. "Certainly not," replied Howick. "I am going to skirt the edge of the discolored water, and I shall take good care to get well to leeward." "All right," the captain answered, and turning to the crew said, "Now, my lads, as quietly as you can." Muffling the sound of their oars by placing straw in the rowlocks, and avoiding the least unnecessary noise, the men skillfully propelled the boat along the outline of the water tinged by the crustacea, so that while the starboard oars still dipped in the green and limpid sea, the larboard were in the deep-dyed waves, and seemed as though they were dripping with blood. "Wine on this side, water on that," said one of the sailors jocosely. "But neither of them fit to drink," rejoined the captain sharply, "so just hold your tongue." Under Howick's guidance the boat now glided stealthily. Illustration: the whale seemed utterly unconscious of the attack that was threatening it. Onto the greasy surface of the reddened waters, where she appeared to float as on a pool of oil. The whale seemed utterly unconscious of the attack that was threatening it, and allowed the boat to come nearer without exhibiting any sign of alarm. The wide circuit which the captain had thought it advisable to take had the effect of considerably increasing the distance between his boat and the Pilgrim, whilst the strange rapidity with which objects at sea become diminished in apparent magnitude, as if viewed through the wrong end of a telescope, made the ship look farther away than she actually was. Another half-hour elapsed, and at the end of it the captain found himself so exactly to leeward that the huge body of the whale was precisely intermediate between his boat and the Pilgrim. A closer approach must now be made, every precaution must be used, but the time had come to get sufficiently near for the harpoon to be discharged. "Slowly, my men," said the captain in a low voice, "slowly and softly." Howick muttered something that implied that the whale had ceased blowing so hard, and that it was aware of their approach. The captain, upon this, enjoined the most perfect silence, but urged his crew onwards, until in 5 or 6 minutes they were within a cable's length of the finback. Erect at the stern the boatswain stood, and maneuvered to get the boat as close as possible to the whale's left flank, while he made it an object of special care to keep beyond the reach of its formidable tail, one stroke of which could involve them all in instantaneous disaster. The manipulation of the boat thus left to the boatswain, the captain made ready for the arduous effort that was before him. At the extreme bow, harpoon in hand, with his legs somewhat astride so as to ensure his equilibrium, he stood prepared to plunge his weapon into the mass that rose above the surface of the sea. By his side, coiled in a pail, and with one end firmly attached to the harpoon, was the first of the 5 lines which, if the whale should dive to a considerable depth, would have to be joined end to end, one after another. "Are you ready, my lads?" said he, hardly above a whisper. "Aye, aye, sir," replied Howick, speaking as gently as his master, and giving a firmer grip to the rudder oar that he held in his hands. Then, alongside at once, was the captain's order, which was promptly obeyed, so that in a few minutes the boat was only about 10 feet from the body of the whale. The animal did not move. Was it asleep? In that case there was hope that the very first stroke might be fatal. But it was hardly likely. Captain Hull felt only too sure that there was some different cause to be assigned for its remaining so still and stationary, and the rapid glances of the boatswain showed that he entertained the same suspicion. But it was no time for speculation. The moment for action had arrived, and no attempt was made on either hand to exchange ideas upon the subject. Captain Hull seized his weapon tightly by the shaft, and having poised it several times in the air, in order to make more sure of his aim, he gathered all his strength and hurled it against the side of the finback. "Backwater!" he shouted. The sailors pushed back with all their might, and the boat in an instant was beyond the range of the creature's tail. And now the immovableness of the animal was at once accounted for. "See, there's a youngster," exclaimed Howick. And he was not mistaken. Startled by the blow of the harpoon, the monster had heeled over onto its side, and the movement revealed a young whale which the mother had been disturbed in the act of suckling. It was a discovery which made Captain Hull aware that the capture of the whale would be attended with double difficulty. He knew that she would defend her little one. If such a term can be applied to a creature that was at least 20 feet long, with the most determined fury, yet having made what he considered a successful commencement of the attack, he would not be daunted, nor deterred from his endeavor to secure so fine a prize. The whale did not, as sometimes happens, make a precipitate dash upon the boat, a proceeding which necessitates the instant cutting of the harpoon line and an immediate retreat, but it took the far more usual course of diving downwards almost perpendicularly. It was followed by its calf. Very soon, however, after rising once again to the surface with a sudden bound, it began swimming along under water with great rapidity. Before its first plunge, Captain Hull and Howick had sufficient opportunity to observe that it was an unusually large Balaenoptera, measuring at least 80 feet from head to tail, its color being of a yellowish-brown, dappled with numerous spots of a darker shade. The pursuit, or what may be more aptly termed the towing, of the whale had now fairly commenced. The sailors had shipped their oars, and the whaleboat darted like an arrow along the surface of the waves. In spite of the oscillation, which was very violent, Howick succeeded in maintaining equilibrium, and did not need the repeated injunctions with which the agitated captain urged his boatswain to be upon his guard. But fast as the boat flew along, she could not keep pace with the whale, and so rapidly did the line run out that except proper care had been taken to keep the bucket, in which it was coiled, filled with water, the friction against the edge of the boat would inevitably have caused it to take fire. The whale gave no indication of moderating its speed, so that the first line was soon exhausted, and the second had to be attached to its end, only to be run out with like rapidity. In a few minutes more it was necessary to join on the third line. It was evident that the whale had not been hit in a vital part, and so far from rising to the surface, the oblique direction of the rope indicated that the creature was seeking yet greater depths. "Confound it!" exclaimed the captain. "It seems as if the brute is going to run out all our line." "Yes, and see what a distance the animal is dragging us away from the Pilgrim," answered Howick. "Sooner or later, however," said Captain Hull, "the thing must come to the surface. She is not a fish, you know." "She is saving her breath for the sake of her speed," said one of the sailors with a grin. But grin as he might, both he and his companions began to look serious when the fourth line had to be added to the third, and more serious still when the fifth was added to the fourth. The captain even began to mutter imprecations upon the refractory brute that was putting their patience to so severe a test. The last line was nearly all uncoiled, and the general consternation was growing very great, when there was observed to be a slight slackening in the tension. "Thank heaven," cried the captain, "the beast has tired herself out at last." Casting his eye towards the Pilgrim, he saw at a glance that she could not be less than 5 miles to leeward. It was a long distance, but when, according to his arrangement, he had hoisted the flag on the boathook which was to be the signal for the ship to approach, he had the satisfaction of seeing that Dick Sands and the negroes at once began bracing the yards to get as near as possible to the wind. The breeze, however, blew only in short, unsteady puffs, and it was only too evident that the Pilgrim would have considerable difficulty in working her way to the whaleboat, even if she succeeded at last. Meantime, just as had been expected, the whale had risen to the surface of the water, the harpoon still fixed firmly in her side. She remained motionless, apparently waiting for her calf, which she had far outdistanced in her mad career. Captain Hull ordered his men to pull towards her as rapidly as they could, and on getting close up, two of the sailors, following the captain's example, shipped their oars and took up the long lances with which the whale was now to be attacked. Howick held himself in readiness to sheer off quickly in the event of the finback making a turn towards the boat. "Now, my lads," shouted the captain, "look out, take a good aim, no false shots. Are you ready, Howick?" "Quite ready, captain," answered the boatswain, adding, "but it perplexes me altogether to see the brute so quiet all of a sudden." "It looks suspicious," said the captain, "but never mind, go on, straight ahead." Captain Hull was becoming more excited every moment. During the time the boat was approaching, the whale had only turned round a little in the water without changing its position. It was evidently still looking for its calf, which was not to be seen by its side. All of a sudden it gave a jerk with its tail, which carried it some few yards away. The men were all excited. Was the beast going to escape again? Was the fatiguing pursuit all to come over a second time? Must not the chase be abandoned? Would not the prize have to be given up? But no, the whale was not starting on another flight. It had merely turned so as to face the boat, and now rapidly beating the water with its enormous fins, it commenced a frantic dash forwards. "Look out, Howick, she's coming," shouted Captain Hull. The skillful boatswain was all on the alert. The boat swerved, as if by instinct, so as to avoid the blow, and as the whale passed furiously by, she received 3 tremendous thrusts from the lances of the captain and the 2 men, who all endeavored to strike at some vital part. There was a sudden pause. The whale spouted up 2 gigantic columns of blood and water, lashed its tail, and with bounds and plunges that were terrible to behold, renewed its angry attack upon the boat. None but the most determined of whalemen could fail to lose their head under such an assault. Calm and collected, however, the crew remained. Once again did Howick adroitly sheer aside, and once again did the 3 lances do their deadly work upon the huge carcass as it rolled impetuously past. But this time, so great was the wave that was caused by the infuriated animal, that the boat was well-nigh full of water, and in imminent danger of being capsized. "Bail away, men," cried the captain. Putting down their oars, the other sailors set to work bailing with all their might. Captain Hull cut the harpoon line, now no longer required, because the whale, maddened with pain and grief for the loss of its offspring, would certainly make no further attempt to escape, but would fight desperately to the very end. The finback was obviously bent on a third onslaught upon the boat, which, being in spite of all the men's exertions still more than half full of water, no longer answered readily to the rudder oar. No one thought of flight. The swiftest boat could be overtaken in a very few bounds. There was no alternative but to face the encounter. It was not long in coming. Their previous good fortune failed them. The whale in passing caught the boat with such a violent blow from its dorsal fin that the men lost their footing and the lances missed their mark. "Where's Howick?" screamed the captain in alarm. "Here I am, captain, all right," replied the boatswain, who had scrambled to his feet only to find that the oar with which he had been steering was snapped in half. "The rudder's smashed," he said. "Take another, Howick, quick," cried the captain. But scarcely had he time to replace the broken oar, when a bubbling was heard a few yards away from the boat, and the young whale made its appearance on the surface of the sea. Catching sight of it instantly, the mother made a fresh dash in its direction. The maternal instincts were aroused, and the contest must become more deadly than ever. Captain Hull looked towards the Pilgrim and waved his signal frantically above his head. It was, however, with illustration. The boat was well-nigh full of water and in imminent danger of being capsized. No hope of succor. He was only too well aware that no human efforts could effectually hasten the arrival of the ship. Dick Sands indeed had at once obeyed the first summons. Already the wind was filling the sails, but in default of steam power her progress at best could not be otherwise than slow. Not only did Dick feel convinced that it would be a useless waste of time to lower a boat and come off with the Negroes to the rescue, but he remembered the strict orders he had received on no account to quit the ship. Captain Hull, however, could perceive that the apprentice had had the aft boat lowered, and was towing it along, so that it should be in readiness for a refuge as soon as they should get within reach. But the whale, close at hand, demanded attention that could ill be spared for the yet distant ship. Covering her young one with her body, she was manifestly designing another charge full upon the boat. "On your guard, Howick, sheer off," bellowed the captain. But the order was useless. The fresh oar that the boatswain had taken to replace the broken one was considerably shorter, and consequently it failed in lever power. There was, in fact, no helm for the boat to answer. The sailors saw the failure, and convinced that all was lost uttered one long despairing cry that might have been heard on board the Pilgrim. Another moment, and from beneath there came a tremendous blow from the monster's tail that sent the boat flying in the air. In fragments, it fell back again into a sea that was lashed into fury by the angry flapping of the finback's fins. Was it not possible for the unfortunate men, bleeding and wounded as they were, still to save themselves by clinging to some floating spar? Captain Hull is indeed seen endeavoring to hoist the boatswain on to a drifting plank, but all in vain. There is no hope. The whale, writhing in the convulsions of death, returns yet once again to the attack. The waters around the struggling sailors seethe and foam. A brief turmoil follows as if there were the bursting of some vast waterspout. In a quarter of an hour afterwards, Dick Sands, with the Negroes, reaches the scene of the catastrophe. All is still and desolate. Every living object has vanished. Nothing is visible except a few fragments of the whaleboat floating on the blood-stained water. Illustration: there is no hope. Chapter 9. Dick's promotion. The first feeling experienced by those on board the Pilgrim, after witnessing the terrible disaster, was one of grief and horror at the fearful death that had befallen the victims. Captain Hull and his men had been swept away before their very eyes, and they had been powerless to assist. Not one was saved. The schooner had reached the spot too late to offer the least resistance to the attacks of the formidable sea monster. When Dick and the Negroes returned to the ship after their hopeless search, with only the corroboration of their sad foreboding that captain and crew had disappeared forever, Mrs. Weldon sank upon her knees. Little Jack knelt beside her crying bitterly, and Dick, old Nan, and all the Negroes stood reverently around her whilst with great devoutness the lady offered up the prayer of commendation for the souls of the departing. All sympathized heartily with her supplications, nor was there any diminution of their fervor when she proceeded to implore that the survivors might have strength and courage for their own hour of need. The situation was indeed very grave. Here was the Pilgrim in the middle of the Pacific, hundreds of miles away from the nearest land, without captain, without crew, at the mercy of the wind and waves. It was a strange fatality that had brought the whale across their path. It was a fatality stranger still that had induced her captain, a man of no ordinary prudence, to risk even his life for the sake of making good a deficient cargo. It was an event almost unknown in the annals of whale fishing that not a single man in the whaleboat should escape alive. Nevertheless, it was all too true. And now, of all those left on board, Dick Sands, the apprentice boy of 15 years of age, was the sole individual who had the slightest knowledge of the management of a ship. The Negroes, brave and willing as they were perfectly ignorant of seamen's duties. And to crown all, here was a lady with her child on board, for whose safety the commander of the vessel would be held responsible. Such were the facts which presented themselves to the mind of Dick, as, with folded arms, he stood gazing gloomily at the spot where Captain Hull, his esteemed benefactor, had sunk to rise no more. The lad raised his eyes sadly. He scanned the horizon with the vain hope that he might perchance descry some passing vessel to which he could confide Mrs. Weldon and her son. For himself, his mind was made up. He had already resolved that nothing should induce him to quit the Pilgrim until he had exhausted every energy in trying to carry her into port. The ocean was all deserted. Since the disappearance of the whale, nothing had broken the monotonous surface either of sea or sky. The apprentice, short as his experience was, knew enough to be aware that he was far out of the common track alike of merchantmen or whalers. He would not buoy himself up with false expectations. He would look his situation full and fairly in the face. He would do his best, and trust hopefully in guidance from the power above. Thus absorbed in his meditations, he did not observe that he was not alone. Negoro, who had gone below immediately after the catastrophe, had again come back upon deck. What this mysterious character had felt upon witnessing the awful calamity, it would be impossible to say. Although with his eye he had keenly taken in every detail of the melancholy spectacle, every muscle of his face had remained unmoved. Not a gesture, not a word betrayed the least emotion. Even if he had heard, he had taken no part, nor evinced the faintest interest in Mrs. Weldon's outpouring of prayer. He had made his way to the stern, where Dick Sands was pondering over the responsibilities of his own position, and stood looking towards the apprentice without interrupting his reverie. Catching sight of him, Dick roused himself in an instant and said, "You want to speak to me?" "I must speak either to the captain or the boatswain," answered the man. "Negoro," said Dick sharply, "you know as well as I do that they are both drowned." "Then where am I to get my orders from?" asked the fellow insolently. "From me," promptly rejoined the apprentice. "From you, from a boy of 15. "Yes, from me," repeated Dick, in a firm and resolute voice, looking at the man until he recoiled under his gaze. "From me." Mrs. Weldon had heard what passed. "I wish everyone on board to understand," she interposed, "that Dick Sands is captain now. Orders must be taken from him and they must be obeyed." Negoro frowned, bit his lip, sneered, and having muttered something that was unintelligible, made his way back to his cabin. Meantime, the schooner under the freshening breeze had been carried beyond the shoal of the crustaceans. Dick cast his eye first at the sails, then along the deck, and seemed to become more and more alive to the weight of the obligation that had fallen upon him. But his heart did not fail him. He was conscious that the hopes of the passengers centered in himself, and he was determined to let them see that he would do his best not to disappoint them. Although he was satisfied of his capability, with the help of the Negroes, to manipulate the sails, he was conscious of a defect of the scientific knowledge which was requisite for properly controlling the ship's course. He felt the want of a few more years' experience. If only he had had longer practice he would, he thought, have been as able as Captain Hull himself, to use the sextant to take the altitude of the stars, to read the time from his chronometer. Sun, moon, and planets should have been his guides. From the firmament, as from a dial plate, he would have gathered the teachings of his true position, but all this was beyond him as yet. His knowledge went no further than the use of the log and compass, and by these alone he must be content to make his reckonings. But he kept up his courage, and did not permit himself for one moment to despair of ultimate success. Mrs. Weldon needed little penetration to recognize the thoughts which were passing in the mind of the resolute youth. "I see you have come to your decision, Dick," she said. "The command of the ship is in your hands. No fear but that you will do your duty, and Tom and the rest of them, no doubt, will render you every assistance in their power." "Yes, Mrs. Weldon," rejoined Dick brightly, "and before long I shall hope to make them good seamen. If only the weather lasts fair, everything will go on well enough, and if the weather turns out bad, we must not despond, we will get safe ashore." He paused a moment, and added reverently, "God helping us." Mrs. Weldon proceeded to inquire whether he had any means of ascertaining the Pilgrim's present position. He replied that the ship's chart would at once settle that. Captain Hull had kept the reckoning accurately right up to the preceding day. "And what do you propose to do next?" she asked. "Of course you understand that in our present circumstances we are not in the least bound to go to Valparaiso if there is a nearer port which we could reach." "Certainly not," replied Dick, "and therefore it is my intention to sail due east, as by following that course we Illustration, we shall soon be on shore. Are sure to come upon some part of the American coast. Do your best, Dick, to let us get ashore somewhere." "Never fear, madam," he answered. "As we get nearer land we shall be almost sure to fall in with a cruiser which will put us into the right track. If the wind does but remain in the northwest, and allow us to carry plenty of sail, we shall get on famously." He spoke with the cheery confidence of a good sailor who knows the good ship beneath his feet. He had moved off a few steps to go and take the helm, when Mrs. Weldon, calling him back, reminded him that he had not yet ascertained the true position of the schooner. Dick confessed that it ought to be done at once, and going to the captain's cabin brought out the chart upon which the ill-fated commander had marked the bearings the evening before. According to this dead reckoning they were in lat. 43 degrees 35 S in long, 164 degrees 13 W, and as the schooner had made next to no progress during the last 24 eventful hours, the entry might fairly be accepted as representing approximately their present position. To the lady's inexperienced eye, as she bent over the outspread chart. It seemed that the land, as represented by the brown patch which depicted the continent of South America extending like a barrier between two oceans from Cape Horn to Colombia, was, after all, not so very far distant. The wide space of the Pacific was not so broad, but that it would be quickly traversed. "Oh, we shall soon be on shore," she said. But Dick knew better. He had acquaintance enough with the scale upon which the chart was constructed to be aware that the Pilgrim herself would have been a speck like a microscopic infusoria on the vast surface of that sea, and that hundreds and hundreds of weary miles separated her from the coast. No time was to be lost. Contrary winds had ceased to blow, a fresh northwesterly breeze had sprung up, and the cirri, or curl cloud, overhead indicated that for some time at least the direction of the wind would be unchanged. Dick appealed to the Negroes, and tried to make them appreciate the difficulty of the task that had fallen to his lot. Tom answered, in behalf of himself and all the rest, that they were not only willing, but anxious, to do all they could to assist him, saying that if their knowledge was small, yet their arms were strong, and added that they should certainly be obedient to every order he gave. "My friends," said Dick, addressing them in reply, "I shall make it a point of myself taking the helm as much as possible, but you know I must have my proper rest sometimes. No one can live without sleep. Now, Tom, I intend you to stand by me for the remainder of the day. I will try and make you understand how to steer by the aid of the compass. It is not difficult. You will soon learn. I shall have to leave you when I go to my hammock for an hour or two." "Is there nothing," said little Jack, "that I can learn to do?" "Oh yes, Jack, you shall keep the wind in order," answered Dick, smiling. "That I will," cried the child, clapping his hands, while the mother drew him to her side. "And now, my men," was Dick's first order to his crew, "we must brace in the yards to sail fair. I will show you how." "All right, Captain Sands, we are at your service," said old Tom gravely. Illustration: "Oh yes, Jack, you shall keep the wind in order." Chapter 10. The New Crew. Dick Sands, captain of the Pilgrim, would not lose a moment in getting his ship under sail. His prime object was to land his passengers safely at Valparaiso, or some other American port, and to accomplish his purpose, it was in the first place necessary that he should ascertain the schooner's rate of speed and the direction that she was taking. This information was to be obtained readily enough by means of the log and compass, and the result of each day's observations would be entered regularly on the chart. The log on board was a patent log, with a dial plate and screw, by means of which the distance that is traveled can be measured accurately for any definite time. It was an instrument so simple that the Negroes were very soon taught its use. The slight error in the reckoning caused by the action of the currents could only be rectified by astronomical observations, which, as already has been stated, were beyond Dick's attainments to make. The idea more than once crossed Dick's mind whether he would not take the Pilgrim back again to New Zealand. The distance was considerably less than it was to America, and had the wind remained in the quarter whence it had been blowing so long, it is more than likely he would have determined to retrace his course, but as the wind had now veered to the northwest, and there was every probability that it was settled for a time, he came to the conclusion that he had better take advantage of it and persevere in making his way towards the east. Accordingly, he lost no time in putting his ship before the wind. On a schooner, the foremast usually carries 4 square sails, on the lower mast a foresail, on the topmast a topsail, on the topgallant a topgallant sail and a royal. The mainmast carries only a mainsail and a topsail. Between the masts upon the forestays can be hoisted a triple tier of triangular sails, while the bowsprit with its jib boom will carry the 3 jibs. The jibs, the mainsail, the main topsail and the staysails are all managed with comparative ease, because they can be hoisted from the deck without the necessity of ascending the mast to let fly the robbins, by which they are fastened to the yards. With the sails on the foremast, it is altogether a more difficult business. In order either to unfurl them, to take them in, or to reef them, it is necessary for a man to clamber up by the shrouds, either to the foretop or to the topgallant crosstrees, and thence mounting by loose ropes, extended below the yards, to hold on by one hand whilst he does his work with the other. The operation requires alike the head and arm of an experienced mariner, and when a fresh breeze has been blowing, it is a casualty far from uncommon that a sailor, confused by the flapping of the canvas and the pitching of the vessel, should be blown overboard in the act. For the unpracticed Negroes, the danger would necessarily be very great. However, the wind at present was very moderate, and the ship plowed her way over the waves without any violent oscillations. At the time when Dick Sands, in obedience to the signal he received from Captain Hull, proceeded to make his way to the scene of the disaster, the Pilgrim, as she lay to, was carrying only her jibs, mainsail, foresail, and foretopsail. In order, therefore, to put her as near as possible to the wind, it had been merely necessary to counterbrace the foresail yard, a maneuver in which the Negroes had rendered all the assistance that was necessary. It was requisite now to do something more. To enable him to get straight before the wind, Dick wanted to increase his sail, and was desirous of hoisting the topgallant, the royal, the maintopsail, and the staysails. He was himself standing at the wheel. "Now, my men," he shouted to the Negroes, "I want your help. Do exactly as I tell you. Bear away, Tom." Tom looked puzzled. "Bear away, unfasten that rope, I mean. And Bat, come along, do the same as Tom." The men did what they were bidden. "That's right," continued Dick, and calling to Hercules said, "Now, Hercules, a good strong pull." To give such a direction to Hercules was somewhat imprudent. The rigging creaked again under his giant strength. "Gently, gently, my good fellow," said Dick, laughing, "you will have the mast down." "I declare I hardly touch the rope," answered Hercules. "Well, next time you must only pretend to touch it," said Dick, and continuing his orders shouted, "Now slacken. Let fly, make fast, now brace in the yards, all right, that's capital." The yards were loosened, the foresails turned slowly round, and, catching the breeze, gave a slight impetus to the ship. Dick's next orders were for the jib sheets to be set free, and then he called the men to the stern. "Now," said he, "we must look to the mainmast, but take care, Hercules, not to have it down." "I will be as careful as possible, Mr. Dick," submissively replied Hercules, as though he were afraid to commit himself to any rash promise. The maneuver was simple enough. The mainsheet was gradually slackened, the great sail took the wind and added its powerful action to that of the foresails. The maintopsail was next brought to bear. It was only clewed up, so that there was nothing to do except to pull the halyards, haul it aboard the tack, and unfurl it. But in pulling at the halyards, the muscular energy of Hercules, which was supplemented by that of Actaeon, not to forget little Jack, who had volunteered his assistance, proved to be overpowering, and the rope snapped in two. All three of them, of course, fell flat upon the deck, but fortunately neither of them was hurt, and Jack laughed heartily at his tumble as an excellent joke. "Up with you," cried Captain Dick. "There's no harm done, splice the rope and haul away more gently next time." It took but a few minutes to execute the order, and the Pilgrim was soon sailing away rapidly with her head to the east. "Well done, my friends," said Dick, who had not left his post at the helm. "You will be first-rate sailors before the end of the voyage." "We shall do our best, I promise you, Captain Sands," replied Tom, making it a point to give the young commander his proper title. Mrs. Weldon also congratulated the new crew upon the success of their first attempt. "I believe it was Master Jack who broke that rope," said Hercules, with a sly twinkle in his eye. "He is very strong, I can tell you." Jack looked as though he thoroughly appreciated the compliment, and evidenced his satisfaction by giving his huge friend a hearty shake of the hand. There were still several sails that were not yet set. Running well before the wind as the Pilgrim was, Dick nevertheless felt that the gallant, royal, and staysails, if brought into service, would materially assist her progress, and he determined not to dispense with their help. The staysails could be hoisted from below, but to bring the gallant and royal into play demanded more experience than any of his crew had had. Knowing that he could not entrust the task to them, and yet resolved not to be balked of his wish to set them, he undertook the task himself. He first put Tom to the helm, showing him how. Illustration: all three of them fell flat upon the deck. To keep the schooner's head in the right direction, and having placed the other four at the royal and topgallant halyards, proceeded to mount the foremast. To clamber up the foreshrouds and the topshrouds onto the crosstrees was mere child's play to the active apprentice. In a few minutes he had unfurled the topgallant sail, mounted to the royal yard, unfurled the royal, again reached the crosstrees, and having caught hold of one of the starboard backstays, had descended to the deck. There he gave the necessary directions, and the two sails were made fast, and both yards braced.